Welcome to Human Monsters. Gordon Stewart Northcott's early life has been documented, but scantily so, and it didn't help that he was a pathological liar. There is even uncertainty around his date of birth. He was born November 9th, 1906 or 1907, in Bladworth, Saskatchewan, Canada. His death certificate indicates that he was born in 1906. He was raised by Louise and George Northcott. What is known is that his mother, Louise, had lost other children to illness. The trauma of these events took a toll on her mental health, and she became determined to induce a miscarriage when she became pregnant with Gordon. After losing her last child, she was far from eager to risk experiencing a repeat occurrence. She would aggressively jump up and down. She rode a horse on the regular, hoping to be thrown from the animal. Recalling Christopher Reeve's example, equestrian injuries can be disabling and even fatal. Ultimately, the horse in question was far too contented for her liking. She tried other methods with no success. Even when Gordon's father, George, kicked her in the spine during a domestic argument, the fetus lived on. George urged Louise to kill the child after all. Even without a fully formed skull, this kid, as a prenatal presence, was like Rasputin. Apparently, you could have taken a shovel to Louise's baby bump and gotten clouded in the face by the kickback. When Gordon was born, his mother wouldn't even look at him. It wasn't because he was coated in afterbirth from head to toe. It was more like she viewed him as just one rung above a tumor, a malignant parasite, a waste product necessitating expulsion to avoid contamination, like urine, feces, pus, and vomit. Later in Gordon's postnatal existence, Louise would do a complete 180 and become obsessed and devoted to Gordon, doting on him and spoiling him whenever possible. There was no discipline whatsoever. He was the prince of the household. As a result, he existed in his own world and would react with rage and deep-rooted malice if anybody attempted to restrict his behavior and activities. Gordon's family moved to Edmonton, Alberta, and then to Vancouver, British Columbia. In 1924, they moved to California. George reflected on Louise's interactions with Gordon when he was a child, following the period when her previous baby perished. After a lapse of several years, following Willie's death, her boy came along. Louise gave him all the affection she had for the one who died, and as much more for him. Naturally, I encouraged her. They were fools. Their love was sublime. Louise said to Gordon during the trial, when he represented himself with predictably disastrous results, "There could not have been any person kinder or better in any way than you have been to me. You are the only one that has ever brought any joy or happiness in my old gray life, and has always used me right and given me any love." Addressing the jury, Gordon said, "I testified, gentlemen, about my relations to the other members of our family, not in an effort, gentlemen, to explain why I had committed this terrible crime called sodomy. But when a child, a little boy of 10 and 11 and 12, as I was at that time, is taught those things by that man who should teach them everything that is right and good and decent, teaches you these things, and you do them from the first. They seem right to you, and they seem right to me now. I know it is the most terrible of all crimes, but when you commit these things from babyhood, it takes a terrible shock to show you what is right and what is wrong. and I believe that shock has been brought to me. I testified how this woman, Louise, had proved herself more than a woman, had went above mother love, had went to greater heights than any mother love could ever carry a person. How she had only raised me as her own baby and child. She did that to give me a name, and how she lived with this man who had committed the most terrible crimes upon his own daughter. She did that although she had lived all these years with the worst hate in her heart, which was only natural. For this man, she lived with him under the outward aspect of wife for the purpose of giving me a name and saving her daughter. George's response: Stewart knows I am not his enemy and wouldn't try to frame him. I gave the boy every cent of my money. I lived with Mrs. Northcott for 42 years, and happily. Until about 5 years ago, that is 1923, when she developed this intense love for the boy. This is a quote from the Los Angeles Evening Herald. From the cradle to the present, Northcott always was the pet of his mother, according to relatives, and was petted and pampered. He was given every luxury his parents could afford. His mother often would dress him in girls' clothes and treat him like a daughter, giving him dolls to play with. Investigators were told, from delicate, effeminate life, the boy swung in early adolescence to the other extreme, officers say. His father says he noted strange tendencies. The co-prosecutor during this trial, Lloyd Kelly, said, if there is one redeeming quality of Louise Northcott, if there is one thing that stands out in her character as human and normal, or rather, in this case, abnormal, it is her affection for this defendant, and I think her testimony upon this witness stand shows it. He is her God. She would sacrifice herself, she would sacrifice her husband, she would sacrifice her other children for this defendant, and she has attempted to do so. As for the so-called strange tendencies, Gordon acquired nicknames like Ape Man, Hairy Ape Man, and Hairy Ape Boy, based on the abnormal growth of body hair that emerged during puberty. Gordon was embarrassed by it and tried removing it with medication, which didn't work. He reportedly suffered neurological damage during an outbreak of influenza that was irreversible. There was also a report of him falling on a patch of ice and hitting his head, further damaging his brain. Mental illness was also something that appeared within his family tree, with 3 cousins having been committed to psychiatric hospitals. Louise recalled the state of Gordon's mind after the brain injuries. Dr. Gray can verify that Stewart's mind has never been just right. Also, after he got that severe fall in the ice, which left him with hemorrhages, he has been worse. Not dangerous, but he would just wander off and imagine all sorts of things. He grieved most terrible for several months, thinking I was dead, and I was his aunt he was living with, and he in her own home with me all the time. When the family moved to Los Angeles, George worked as a contractor, Louise at the laundry of a hospital. Stewart worked as a grocery clerk and went to school. Like with many other aspects of Stewart's early personal history, the point at which he began to sexually abuse children has been a matter of debate. While going to school in Los Angeles, Stewart became friends with a boy named Claude Scott. Stewart became a frequent visitor to the Scott domicile. Claude had a younger brother named Philip, who was nicknamed Philly. On July 25, 1925, police arrested Stewart on a charge of statutory rape visited upon Philly. who was between 9 and 12 years old. Either the charges were dropped or Stewart was merely given probation. In the company of his nephew Sanford, Stewart would mourn the loss of Philly after his family moved away. He would play Philly's favorite song called Song of Songs on the piano in tribute to him. Stewart had lusted after Philly and became considerably infatuated with him. Afterwards, mourning would lead to anger, and Stewart would knock Sanford down. The night before he was executed, Stewart played a recording of Song of Songs. As for other aspects of his sexual history, denizens of Pasadena Avenue's Arroyo Seco neighborhood said that he had become embroiled in a scandal involving homosexuality in 1926. 4 boys were arrested for this crime. Though Stewart was not arrested in connection with this crime, residents of this district recall that he had some connections with it and was dubbed the Sheik of Pasadena Avenue. It was about that time when Stewart struck up a conversation with a neighbor who was a doctor. He asked him about quicklime's effectiveness in dissolving mortal remains. The good doctor confirmed that it was indeed efficient at accelerating the decomposition process. In 1926, Stewart approached his father and said, "Dad, I wish you would buy some acreage, and I will start a chicken ranch. I have seen some land that will suit me, and will make arrangements for you to see it next Sunday." His father wound up buying him 3 acres in the township of Wineville in Riverside County. There was a problem. Stewart could not manage such an operation by himself, even at such a small scale. You see, he was kind of a bird brain himself. Yeah, I know, hardy har har. Stewart became inspired, and this time his idea involved his native Canada. His new plans involved his sister Winifred and her children. George recalled what he remembered about this event. One day, 3 or 4 months after the farm was purchased, when I came home from work, he said to me he was going to Saskatoon and look up one of Fred's children, and if possible, he was going to bring one of them back with him. He gave me that information one night, and he left the next morning. Looked to me as if he had already made arrangements to go. Stewart made the long drive to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. He spent 2 weeks with the Clark family. Winifred had 4 children, and 2 of them appealed to Stewart's degenerate proclivities. Kenneth was 11 years old, and Sanford was 13 years old. Sanford said later, "All the time Stewart was there, he was trying to get either Kenneth or I to come with him. He said he would take me to Regina." Sanford's parents gave their consent for Sanford to accompany Stewart to Regina, the capital of Saskatchewan. The day of the trip, Stewart informed Sanford, after their departure, that they were going straight to Los Angeles. Sanford didn't object. He said of this event, "I was surprised. I wanted to go to Regina. I didn't know where he was going, what he was going to do when he got there." Stewart and Sanford stayed at George and Louise's house for 2 weeks. Following this period, they went to Stewart's chicken ranch in Wineville. For a week, Stewart and Sanford worked on the landscape, clearing away weeds. No house had been built, so they slept in a tent. Stewart slept on a cot and Sanford on the floor. George began working with them to build a house, garage, and a facility to house the chickens. There were also rabbit hutches, a goat house, a brooder house, a grain house, and hen runs. Stewart ran this farm like a tin pot dictator. Sanford was required to get up between 5:30 and 6 a.m., whereupon he was to first feed and water the chickens. His next task was to make breakfast for Stewart and himself. Once the meal was prepared, he would awaken Stewart. Stewart didn't do any farm work. In fact, he didn't spend much time around the property. He was usually away running errands. Sanford never knew where he had been. Another requirement was that Sanford restrict his social interactions to those with Stewart. As Sanford recalled, Stewart did not want me to go out and talk to people, and there was things at the ranch there to do. Neighbors visited on occasion, but Stewart forbade him from playing with their children. Stewart placed other restrictions on Sanford. To quote Sanford, Stewart did not want me to go to school because he knew they would inquire where I was last to school and trace me back to Canada. Inquiries were made anyway. A local teacher somehow became aware that Sanford was not attending school and asked Stewart why. Stewart said that Sanford was attending a local Catholic school. The same woman returned the next year after finding out Sanford still wasn't in school. Stewart really hit the roof that time. As Sanford recalled, Stewart was pretty mad, and he went over to see her that day, or that same night, and he came back after that and he wrote a letter to her. Stewart wrote that Sanford was 16 years old when he was only 14. He said he studied under Jesuits and spent many hours in study every week. The truth was, he wasn't even homeschooled. He was just a slave. Stewart was so uptight about his and Sanford's privacy because of a very dark secret Stewart was keeping. Stewart had been sodomizing Sanford. It happened 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more. Stewart would coat his penis in Vaseline before buggering his nephew. About twice a month, Sanford would be forced to take the alpha position and penetrate Stewart. Sexual abuse wasn't the only form of torture Stewart inflicted on Sanford. He would physically abuse him. Sanford recalled these tortures in court. Co-prosecutor Loyal Kelsey. What did he do? Sanford. He kept beating me all the time. With what? Anything he could get a hold of. State some of the things he beat you with. A club or lathe, or he used his belt lots of times. What was that, a leather belt? The belt he wears to hold his pants up, leather belt. Which end of the belt did he use on you? Both ends. Did one of them have a buckle on it? Yes, sir. Heavy or light? Heavy. Did he use that end on you? Yes, sir. Do you remember any of the things that he punished you for in that manner? He would just lose his temper, anything at all I would do, if I would not work fast enough or anything. Was that of frequent occurrence or just occasionally? Frequent. Frequent? Yes, sir. You have mentioned the lathe and club and belt. What do you mean by club? Well, just a board, anything he could get a hold of. Any piece of timber he could get hold of? Yes, sir. Ever strike you with anything else? I don't remember. Anything at all he could get hold of, he strikes me with. Did he ever strike you with his fist? Yes, sir. Ever strike you with anything else? I don't remember. Anything at all he could get hold of, he strikes me with. Did he ever strike you with his fist? Yes, sir. Were you ever struck on the head with anything? Yes, sir. What? All kinds of things. His belt or club or anything. Do you remember any particular occasion when you were struck on the head, and with what? Yes, sir. What? I was struck on the head with a club one day. What did it do to your head when you were struck on that occasion? It made a big cut in it. Did you have any scar from it? Yes, sir. Do you know whether that scar is on your head yet? Yes, sir, it is. Were you ever struck on the body anywhere to the extent that it left any scars on you? Yes, sir. Whereabouts on your body? All over. Were you ever cut anywhere? Yes, sir. Where? On the wrist. What made that scar? A knife. Who struck you with the knife? Stewart threw it at me. What kind of a knife was it? Butcher knife. What did he throw the butcher knife at you for, do you know? He got mad at me. Do you know what about? I don't know. No. Besides being struck, did he ever do anything else to you in the way of hurting you? Yes, sir. What? He has poured water on me at different times. Hot water. Hot water. Yes, sir. Whereabouts on you? On the back. And are there any of those scars on your back now, do you know? Yes, sir. Will you remove your sweater and shirt? Sanford removed said garments. Kelsey said, Just show your back to the jury, will you? Sanford turned to face the jury. Kelsey addressed them, saying, Gentlemen of the jury, if you get up closer, you will observe the boy's back from the top of the shoulder down to the middle of the backbone on the right-hand side, near the backbone. He turned to Sanford. Do you know what caused that scar there? Yes, sir. What was it? Hot water. There appears to be some other scars on the left side of the middle of the back and to the left. Do you know what caused those? The club or belt or anything at all? Did Stewart do anything for you afterwards to help you? Yes, sir. What? He fixed it up, took my shirt off, and put some salve on it. Were you ever injured by Stewart in any way that caused you to lose consciousness out there, Sanford? No. How many times were you hit on the head? A lot of times. Do you know how many? No, sir. Were you afraid of Stewart? Yes, sir. Are you afraid of him now? Yes, sir. I think you testified that you were, at times, left alone there on the ranch while Stewart was away before Jessie, his sister, came. Why didn't you run away then? I was scared to. Why were you scared to? Stewart always threatened me not to, that he would kill me if I did. Didn't you ever try to run away before Jessie came? No. How much do you weigh now? 117 when I last weighed. 117 pounds when you were last weighed. Yes, sir. Do you know what you weighed when the officers got you at the ranch? Yes, sir. How much? 98 1/2 pounds. A few of Northcott's neighbors testified that they witnessed incidents of abuse in which Sanford was beaten by Stewart with a belt, a lathe, a stick, or with his fist. One of the neighbors noted that Northcott struck Sanford so hard that the blows could be heard from a long distance away. One neighbor decided to move away after living adjacent to Northcott after only 2 months. When asked about this by a prosecutor, he said, I moved away from there because I was afraid to live there by him. Why was that? He had such a mean disposition and temper that I was afraid of him. Northcott controlled Sanford in other ways. That included the letters he could write home to his family. Northcott would censor and approve the content. To quote Sanford, Stewart would always read my letters and tell me what to write and send them away himself. I was going to school and had lots of friends, everything like that. The latter intel was, of course, false. If Northcott didn't like the way Sanford wrote something, he would make him do it all over again. Eventually, Northcott would spread his tentacles afield. Sanford recalled that he would drive off in search of new victims. When he announced it to Sanford, he would refer to it as going away for fresh meat. Sanford recalled that this happened 10 to 12 times, or at least that was what he could remember. As he put it, his uncle would bring young male miners back to the farm and, quote, do them, unquote. Stewart used that terminology to describe sexual abuse. He typically let them go afterwards. Prosecutor Loyal Kelly asked Sanford in court, "Did you ever go and look at those boys when they were there?" "Not to see their face." "Why not?" Stewart would take them right into the house at night, and it was dark. When he brought the boys there to the house as you described, what did you do? "I would stay outside." "Why did you stay outside?" "Stewart told me to." "Did you ever try to see in the windows and see what was going on?" "Yes, sir, but he would always have them covered." "Covered with what?" "Blankets or sheets and things." "How long would he stay in the house with those boys?" "About an hour or an hour and a half, and then take them away." "How large boys did you see?" "They were not very big." "By comparison to your size now?" "About my size and smaller." "How frequently did he bring boys there that way?" "Not very frequently." "Could you tell us about how often?" "Well, sometimes he would bring one a week, and sometimes it would be a long time." "All this time he was committing sodomy on you, was he?" "Yes, sir." "When he brought these boys out there, did that make any difference in his relations with you?" "No. He would not do it to me any more while they were there, but afterwards." "Did he ever take any precautions when he brought those boys there, that you know of?" "Well, he would keep their eyes covered when he brought them up there." "He would keep their eyes covered when he brought them up there?" "Yes, sir, so that they could not see where they were coming." During the investigation, detectives interviewed a couple of boys Stewart Northcott attempted but failed to molest. They testified against him in court. One of them was 10-year-old Junior Thompson. According to Junior, he became separated from his family as they were entangled with activities at a recreational event. Junior went to a bench to sit down. Stewart followed him there and sat beside him. He asked Junior if he wanted to make some easy money. He asked Northcott how. To quote Junior, he said his nuts kind of tickled and he wanted me to play with them. Junior refused. Stewart tried the tack of asking him if he would like to go to his car and see his dog, who he claimed could do tricks. Stewart asked him to get in the car. When Junior refused, Northcott grabbed him by the arm and attempted to pull him in. Junior yanked himself free and ran. Junior ran to his father and reported what Stewart had done. Eventually his father caught up with Stewart and brandished a penknife. Stewart got away, but Junior's father took note of the make of the car and the type of dog inside, not to mention aspects of Northcott's physical appearance. The other boy who came dangerously close to being victimized by Northcott was Stephen Neal Black, who was about 15 years old at the time. It was summer of 1928, and Stewart brought Stephen to his ranch 3 times. During the second trip, according to Stephen, Stewart took him to one of the bedrooms and, quote, tried to screw me. Stewart was unable to bring this to fruition. He tried it in the past when he took him to the Hollywood Bowl. He brought him to a hotel and tried to sodomize him. Stewart had made several business proposals to Stephen's parents that he never intended to make good on. It was all part of the grooming process to gain their trust so he could get access to Stephen. While at the hotel, Northcott made another proposal, this time one that would benefit Stephen himself. As Stephen recalled, "He told me about a lot of insurance he had, and if he was going to die, he was going to leave it to me and all that stuff. He just wanted me to get undressed and go to bed with him for a while. So I did, and when I got in there, he tried to do what I said to me." Prosecutor Earl Redwine said, "What did he do?" "He tried to screw me." How long was he about it? Oh, maybe 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes. Did he touch you? Yes, sir. How? Tell these folks. He just touched me, that was all. With his private parts? Yes, sir. Where did he touch you? In my back. Between your legs? Yes, sir. Stephen went on to say that this attempt at rape was unsuccessful. He said he was never afraid of Northcott and did not report the incident to his parents at the time. Sanford related an incident wherein Northcott went into Los Angeles for the day and came back claiming to have killed a Mexican man. He proved it to Sanford by pulling the man's head out of a pail. They built a bonfire and burned the head and the man's clothes. He left the man's body by the side of the road near Puente. When Sanford asked him why he killed the man, he said it was because he knew too much. He didn't elaborate. It burned into the night. He took the charred remains and disposed of them at the dump. The story he gave about the murder was alleged to be bogus, but he described the decapitation of the man, which he did with a handsaw, in a way that could be accurate. You'd be surprised how easy it was to saw it off. It only took 5 strokes of the saw to do it. I started to saw it off. I sawed it off down close to the shoulders, and after I'd given 2 strokes on the saw, I almost fainted. I fell back, and Sanford picked up the saw and finished the job with 3 more strokes. Burning it proved to be far more difficult, as Northcott told it. We burned it all afternoon there in the yard, but it would not burn up. When he finally took it out of the fire, it seemed like it had something like soft rubber inside of it. Northcott hit the head with an axe 2 or 3 times, but could not break it. The head would just roll like a bowling ball, the man's disfigured nose bumping across the ground with every revolution. Northcott and Sanford eventually took it to the nearest stretch of desert and buried it in the sand. The coroner examined the corpse of the headless Mexican, who would eventually become known as John Doe. He wrote that the man was about 18 years old and, quote, 5 feet 5 to 6 inches, estimated weight about 140 pounds. The hair was a very dark brown, almost black. Further examination showed a gunshot wound entering the front of the right chest at a point 8 1/2 inches below the right shoulder level and 3 1/2 inches to the right of the median line. The course of this wound was to the left, backward, and slightly upward. It had passed through the right lung, the middle and lower lobes of the right lung. It passed through the intervertebral disc between the 6th and 7th vertebrae, therefore passing behind the heart. It had passed through the left lung to a space between the 5th and 6th ribs and was located under the skin at a point under the left chest on the back, a point 6 1/2 inches below the left shoulder level and 4 1/2 inches to the left of the back median line. Stewart Northcott claimed he killed the man in self-defense. The preceding details suggested a massacre. The cause of death was ruled to be the gunshot. The man was never identified, so he was identified in legal documents as John Doe. March 10th, 1928, the day 9-year-old Walter Collins went missing. He was reported missing on the 15th, and a nationwide search was undertaken. He was not found alive. Walter Collins and Stewart Northcott's paths crossed, and, as you can imagine, this turn of events would end in tragedy for Walter. As the story goes, Stewart brought Walter to his ranch and kept him in the hen house. Reportedly, he was incarcerated there for about a week. Stewart sexually abused him, giving him the same treatment as his other victims. It was Northcott's mother Louise who decided that the boy should be slaughtered. She said to Stewart and Sanford, "Each of us will strike a blow, and then, if we are ever found out, we will all be equally guilty." It was all part of Louise's history of indulging Stewart's every whim, no matter how pernicious. Sanford testified about her role in the murder at her trial. This dialogue was transcribed from the court transcript. How was Walter killed? He was killed with an axe. Where was he in the henhouse? What was he doing in the henhouse when he was killed? Sleeping. Did you see him killed? Yes, sir. What was he sleeping on? A cot. What kind of a cot? A camp cot. Who struck the Collins boy with the axe? Stewart, Northcott, and grandmother and me. All three of you struck him. Yes, sir. Where was he struck? What part of the body? On the head. Who hit him first? Stewart. What kind of an axe did he use? A big axe. Was there any light in there at the time you struck him? Only the flashlight. Who had the flashlight? I did. How many times did Stewart strike him? 2 or 3 times. Who struck him next? I did. Was he struck again? Yes, sir. By whom? Grandmother. How many times? 2 or 3 times. What did the boy do when he was struck by Stewart? He fell off the bed. Did he make any noise? Yes, sir. What kind of a noise? A groaning noise. Was he still groaning or moving at the time your grandmother struck him? Yes, sir. What was done with the boy? He was buried. Where? In the henhouse. Louise's version of this event was markedly different. To quote Louise, I walked in and reached up to get the lantern. I said, "Why have you gone to bed?" The boy's clothes was down by the side of the cot. He did not answer me. I said, "Are you awake, son?" He never answered me. I walked over and put the flashlight on him, and he was laying there with his eyes half open and froth on his mouth, and he was dead. I shouted to Stewart. He did not hear me because he was fixing the radio, and Sanford was right there. As soon as I saw it, he came in, and I said, "There is something wrong with this boy. He is dead." I shouted to Sanford to tell Stewart, so he came running out. I did not know what to do. It was the first time I was ever with death like that. But to touch the boy, I never touched the boy. I never harmed the boy in any way, and I would never hit anybody with an axe. If I did go to do anything, I would have done it with a gun. I never touched any boy. She was questioned by Loyal Kelly. During that round of questioning, she made a concession. "I am going to tell you, my mind has been going off so much, what I have been told with what I have done, that I cannot think. My mind does not function, but that is right. What the Riverside County Sheriff and Mr. Redwine said, that is the way I found the boy, with his head crushed in, just as they said. Did you do anything to him when you found him that way? I think that... Yes, I did. I took the axe and hit him on the temple and finished him up to keep him out of his suffering." He was alive at that time, was he? Yes, sir, alive, and that is all. Louise retracted this statement soon after. Supposedly, Stewart's motive for killing him was that he had witnessed him killing a man. Walter's remains were initially covered with quicklime and buried in a shallow grave. Eventually, he was unearthed and burned in a barrel. May 16th, 1928. Brothers Louis Winslow, 12 years old, and Nelson, 10 years old, disappeared on this day. The story, according to Sanford, was that Stewart had been out all day and returned at 10 p.m. As Sanford put it, he told me he had some friends of his there. Stewart got out of his car while Lewis and Nelson remained inside. Stewart pulled Sanford aside and said, "Go out and get things fixed up in the hen house for them, water and things over there." The house was being plastered, and Sanford and Stewart were relegated to staying in the incubator house. He also told Sanford to bring out some bedding and linens. To prevent Lewis and Nelson from escaping the incubator house, Stewart had Sanford hammer nails into the door from the outside. The next morning, Sanford made breakfast for everyone and brought it out to the incubator house. Later that day, Stewart told Sanford that his victims' names were Lewis and Nelson Winslow, and that he picked them up in Pomona. He said he brought them to the farm to, quote, "do them." Stewart kept the boys at the ranch for a week and a half. Sanford didn't spend much time in the incubator house during that time. He mostly did chores and provided refreshments. Stewart would take the boys out at night sometimes. The boys would entertain themselves by drawing and playing card games. To evade capture, Stewart ordered both boys to write a letter to their parents. One letter was postmarked May 19th and read, "Dear Mother and Dad, we are going to Mexico to make a lot of money making yachts and airplanes. A woman gave us something to eat. Don't worry, we will be okay. Louie and Nels." The second letter was postmarked May 28th. Both boys were dead by that date. The letter went, "Dear Mother and Dad, we are well and having a wonderful adventure. Our only trouble is in getting something to eat. We travel at night and sleep in barns during the day. Is our names in the papers yet? If we can get far enough away and stay hid enough, we will be as famous as Lindbergh. Please do not show anyone this letter. Do not worry. We will be all right. Love from Louie and Nelson Winslow." On the 25th, Northcott said to Sanford, "We will have to put them out of the way." He said the murders would have to be committed with an axe because, quote, "he wouldn't make any noise that way. Nobody could hear it. I didn't want to kill them. I knew they would only go away and tell about it." When Stewart cross-examined Sanford in court about this aspect of the case, he asked him why he participated in the murder if he didn't want the boys to be hurt. Stewart began with, "Now, these Winslow boys, did you propose any other scheme besides murdering them?" "No." "Why?" "It wouldn't do any good anyway." "I see. You are positive of that?" "Yes." "What made you come to that conclusion?" "Well, you decided to kill them, and I couldn't do anything else." "I see. And that's all there was to it?" "Yes." "When I decided on anything, it was done. Is that the idea?" "Yes." "Did you know that you could have released those boys and went over to the nearest neighbors and got police protection?" "Yes." "Why didn't you do it?" "Afraid of you." "I couldn't very well hurt you when you had police protection." "You had threatened to get me. You must have quite a good opinion of my ability." On May 26th at 9 a.m., Sanford began digging a grave in one of the hen houses. This took hours. Another factor that slowed them down was the execution method. To quote Sanford, "We tried to kill the biggest one with ether." Nelson was dispatched to the farmhouse, while Lewis remained in the hen house. Bizarrely, Stewart said to Lewis, according to Sanford, that he was giving him ether so that it would make him smaller, so that nobody would know him. Lewis did not want to have ether. He had taken it before, and he did not like it. It made him sick. Stewart and Sanford persuaded Lewis to lay down on a cot in the hen house. They cut the handle off a colander and placed it over the boy's face. They draped a cloth over it and poured most of the contents of a can of ether over it, so that he would at least inhale the fumes. Lewis did faint, but he remained unconscious for only a minute or two. He soon woke and vomited. Nelson was brought to the henhouse. Stewart decided upon the execution method, as Sanford explained. Stewart said we were going to kill them with an axe that night. Stewart said that was the only way for us to do it. That evening, Lewis was sent to the farmhouse. Nelson was kept in the incubator house. Sanford said that Nelson was killed before Lewis. He reversed the order while being cross-examined by Northcott. At first, they distracted Nelson as a duo, with Sanford making small talk with him and Stewart going through the motions of tending to the eggs. Once Nelson's attention was directed at Sanford, Stewart snuck up behind him and clouted him on the back of his head with the blunt end of his axe. Nelson made a gasping sound and collapsed to the floor. Stewart hit him on the head with the axe 2 or 3 more times. He handed the axe to Sanford and went outside to see if anybody else was on the property. Earlier that day, he informed Sanford he would participate in a murder. He told him he would kill him if he refused to get involved, and that he would do the same if he turned him in. Nelson was struck with a hatchet 2 or 3 times before Stewart and Sanford brought him to an adjoining structure. Nelson was still alive. He was making guttural noises, though he did not appear to be conscious. They buried him in this condition. More detail emerged during Stewart's cross-examination of Sanford in court. Sanford said, "You went in the house to get the other one, while I put some earth over his head to stop the noise he was making, and then scraped that over, the dirt over the top of the blood where he was killed." "How much?" "You put enough earth over him, you say, to stop the noise. What kind of a noise was he making?" "The noise he was making? A groaning noise." "A groaning noise. A groan. Do you know the difference between a gasping noise and a groaning noise?" "It was between them both. An awful noise." "An awful noise?" "Yes, sir." "It took quite a bit of earth to stop it, did it?" "I did not put enough on it to stop it all, but I just put some on to stop some of it." "You stopped about how much of it? What %?" "I don't know." "That thickness of dirt?" "No, just threw a little over his head, just enough to cover his head." "Nothing on the rest of the body?" "No." Lewis was struck with the hatchet by Sanford. The first blow knocked him down, but did not kill him. Sanford whacked him several more times. Stewart struck Lewis with his axe. They followed up by carrying Lewis to his grave. He was buried next to his brother. Stewart and Sanford cleaned all traces of the boys from the farm structures, down to every last droplet of blood. Jacob Dahl and his family had fallen on hard times. He went to a branch of the Salvation Army in June of 1928, seeking assistance with finding a job. While he waited to meet with a member of the staff, he overheard a young man having a conversation with a woman who worked there. At one point, Dahl's name came up. The woman mentioned to the young man, Stewart Northcott, that Jacob had 4 young sons, all minors. Their ages as of January 1929 were 8, 12, 14, and 15. Northcott's eyes lit up like a miner in a candy store. Stewart chose Dahl among the many candidates. He was likely looking for laborers on his chicken ranch, and Jacob's family were desperate. On his way out the office, Stewart unknowingly passed right by Jacob. Dahl recalled Northcott's disposition. He looked pleased, as far as I can say. Very much so. It seems he had got what he wanted. The staffer, Mrs. Fields, came out of her office and approached Jacob Dahl. She said, "I just sent a gentleman to your place. I think he has got something for you. I wish you would go out as soon as you can." She arranged to have her secretary drive Jacob home immediately so he wouldn't miss Northcott's visit. About 45 minutes later, Stewart Northcott pulled up at the Dahl domicile. Only Jacob was home at the time. Northcott introduced himself as Mr. Craig. He gave him one of Mrs. Craig's business cards and asked him if he knew her. Jacob said he did. Northcott said he was a private secretary to Mrs. Rowan of Pasadena. Jacob invited him inside. Once inside, Northcott told Dahl that his brother was the secretary and that he provided assistance to him when necessary. The so-called Mr. Craig had more information about Mrs. Craig, as Dahl explained. Mr. Craig said that this woman was very rich and that she could afford to spend the money, and that she was spending a lot of money for charitable purposes, and that she wanted to spend it directly through her secretary. She did not want to give it to any institution or anything like that, because they mostly spent it on themselves. It did not get to the sources where it was needed. Well, I said, Mr. Craig, I will be satisfied. I will sure appreciate anything you can do for me. I have been sick, I says, and I have not been able to work any. I am in hard luck down here in this town. I am a stranger down here, and anything you do will be appreciated. And he said he had a ranch that he could put me on. He would pay me $150 a month, and he had a nice house out there for the family free of charge that he would let me have. And that now, he says, New Year's time, of course, you know these big corporations have. And that now, he says, New Year's time, of course, you know these big corporations have to pay a big income tax. And we usually split it up among the employees. And you will be in line for getting $200 or $300 out of that. A bonus, he called it. And another thing he says, you will be in line for a promotion, which will net you probably, I don't hardly recall now, but something like $300 or $350 a month that I could have. The ranch was located somewhere in the neighborhood of Pomona. He said these Rowan buildings were pretty well scattered out through that country, and she had several ranches. But this was the C ranch that I was going to work on. He said that we were going to have a house there free, that he could furnish that. He would furnish it up for us. Well, he could give us some furniture, he said, and practically everything that was needed there. And if there was not enough there, he would let me have some. He said I could draw a month's wages ahead so that I could buy it. And in fact, he said he would go up to Pomona to some furniture house or some house up there and fix my credit so that would be all right, so that I could get anything I wanted. That was all good. I was satisfied. I accepted the deal, of course. Amid the nascency of the Great Depression, this sounded like a good deal. Northcott returned the next day to inquire about Jacob's sons. He would make 2 or 3 more appearances that week alone, typically unannounced. Once he had a look at the Dowell boys. He offered to raise Jacob's salary from $120 a month to $150 a month. Northcott was willing to pay top dollar for these victims. Like many pedophiles, he began by grooming from the parents down to the children, like a worm burrowing into an apple, whereupon they would rot from the inside out. Northcott appealed to Jacob's sense of patriarchal nobility within the family, as Dahl recalled while being cross-examined by Northcott. I cannot exactly recall the words, but you said something about my being their daddy, and of course, that is more or less of a hero to his boys. The more he can do for them, the bigger hero he is. Northcott sent a truck to the family's house so that they could all move to the ranch. During their commute, Louise accompanied them. She was introduced to the Dahls as Mrs. Mayo. When asked by Ella Dahl if she had any children, she said she had one 14-year-old son at the ranch. That boy, of course, was Sanford. When he peered in at the Dahls once they were settled in the farmhouse, he appeared nervous. With good reason, Stewart announced his intentions for the family. To quote Sanford, he was going to kill them so that he could get their children. Stewart detailed the role Sanford was to play in this turn of events. Sanford explains, "I was supposed to be my grandmother's son. My grandmother was supposed to be my mother. Stewart was to bring the dolls out to the ranch, quote, and take them in the house, and take Mr. Doll out first, and kill him, and then bring her out." Before Stewart departed for the doll's house, he ordered Sanford to have a grave prepared. When Stewart returned, to quote Sanford, "He came and looked at the grave and asked me if I had it all fixed up. He was mad because he did not think it was deep enough for them. He came out and put on his overalls and took some of the earth out of it and got the guns and things out in the hen house and the axes ready. Then I was just staying around outside until Stewart got ready, until they finished eating. Stewart and Louise told me to stay outside and watch that nobody came around. Sanford frequently went out to the barns and back, explaining to the dolls that a man was out back fixing the pump. Stewart explained his absences by saying he was meeting with a so-called efficiency expert named Mr. Peterson. He gave as the reason for doing this, according to Ella, to see what sort of people he was going to put on this ranch, and wanted to meet Mr. Doll and I, and that he was very peculiar in his ways, and we didn't go out and meet him, but of course we were very anxious to get this job, so we were very glad to go. He was supposed to be away, to be fixing a pump or something, and Mr. Craig went out several times to see if he couldn't come in, and it seems he wouldn't. My husband offered to go out and see him, but Mr. Craig didn't want him to do that. He said he would take offense at that he was very eccentric over foolish little things. Mr. Craig took off his coat because he had to work on the engine, and later on he came in with his hands dirty and wanted to wash his hands. Louise's behavior was even more eccentric. When she was setting the table, Ella offered to help. Louise handed her a plate of sliced peaches. Ella noticed something peculiar about the peaches. 3 or 4 capsules floating on top, and I made the remark, "Look at the capsules." And she took them from me, and she says she called them some name I don't remember now, and I put the peaches on the table. Ella was reminded of quinine capsules, though noted that the capsules on the peaches were not as big. Their sumptuous banquet consisted, aside from peaches and mysterious pharmaceuticals, of white Nucoa, a brand of margarine, bread, and coffee. Ella recalled how the meal proceeded. We ate our peaches, and I noticed Mr. Craig wasn't eating, and he was the one that suggested eating because he was so hungry. And so I looked at him and I wondered why he wasn't eating. And as I looked at him, he was watching me. And when he saw me, he pretended to eat, but he didn't eat. Mr. Craig was looking at Jacob very intently and very excitedly. His eyes were dilated. That made me look at him again. And he saw me looking at him again. And he started to eat his peaches. Pretended to eat them. Afterward, it was time to go home, so he came in and told us it wasn't necessary to see Mr. Peters, and he said it was all right that we were hired. The truth was, Stewart Northcott had not hired the dolls. He just spared their lives. As Sanford put it, he was scared he could not get away with it. Stewart drove the dolls home. He instructed Jacob to learn all he could about irrigation. After Stewart returned home, he and Sanford filled the grave. As they did so, Northcott declared, as Sanford put it, he would get them afterwards when he got things fixed up better than he had. The next day, Stewart notified the dolls that they would not be hired because the owner of the property passed away and his wife announced that no one was to be hired at that time. Stewart reassured Ella that he would not forget them. Most ominously, he said, I am very much interested in you and your boys." Meanwhile, suspicions were brewing up in the Great White North. Sanford's family found his letters to be contrived. The language used was not indicative of Sanford's level of literary ability. They were the kinds of letters one would write if they were hiding something from their parents and were adamant about conveying exactly what they wanted to hear. The novelist Elmore Leonard once remarked that part of his literary ethic was, "If it sounds like writing, I rewrite it." When Stewart Northcott dictated these letters to Sanford, he was going for eloquence. Given Sanford's manner of speaking during the trial, one can surmise that while he communicated effectively, he was not articulate beyond the level of a typical middle school student. Sanford's 19-year-old sister, Jessie, had been deputized into the role of becoming a secondary caregiver to Sanford. She commented about the letters. "I was worried about him because his letters showed no improvement in his writing or education. I had a suspicion that he was not going to school. I wanted to find out for myself. That was one reason why I went to California. For 2 years, I had saved up money to go to California. I had never been more than 50 miles away from my little hometown of Saskatoon. I always wanted to go to California, especially after my brother, Sanford, went down there." Sanford recalled the reason for Jessie's visit. "My father became suspicious that I was not going to school, sent my sister down to see if I was." Jessie departed for Los Angeles in July 1928. She arrived on the 26th. Stewart and Sanford were not present to pick her up and take her to the ranch. It was only after Jessie's mother called Stewart that he agreed to pick Jessie up the next morning. When he saw her, he said, "So, it's you. I thought it was your mother." This was a lie. He had received a telegram soon after her departure notifying him that she would be visiting. Noting Northcott's displeasure, Sanford said he did not want her coming out at all and spoiling his plans and things. Jessie reported on what she observed at the ranch. "I found Sanford working on the farm. He had to do all the work. His hands showed that. He looked peaked and wore dirty overalls. While he seemed to be right pleased to see me, was very quiet, and he seemed to be afraid to almost move. He said he was going to school and was getting along fine in school, much better than when he was at home, and told me he had a lot of boyfriends." One day Jessie wrote a letter she was to send to her mother. She described what happened at this time that aroused her suspicions. "Sanford came in and told me to be sure that I saw it and posted it myself. I asked him why. 'Well,' he said, 'if Stewart gets hold of it, it won't go.' Is that why you never wrote home any oftener than you did?" Sanford said that this was so. He told her Northcott dictated all his letters. Sanford would never allow her to buttonhole him so they could have a private talk. She learned more that evening. As she put it, "I imagine it would be around 10 p.m. We had all gone to bed, and I laid awake a long time until I could hear Stewart's regular breathing from the other room, and then I crawled out of bed and went over to Sanford's bed, and I got in beside him, and I put my hand over his mouth and woke him up. And then I asked him to put the covers up over our heads, and I asked him some questions then." She got him to admit he had been beaten by Northcott. He also confessed to her that he had not attended school since he arrived at the ranch. This is from the court transcript of Northcott's cross-examination of Jessie. "What else did you ask him?" "I asked him what else you did to him." "What did he say?" "You know what he said. I wish you would repeat it." "You mean he told you I had committed the crime called sodomy upon him?" "Yes." "Is that what he said?" "Yes." "And what did you say to those answers that he gave you?" "I asked him why he didn't return home and tell us about it." "And he said what?" Said he was afraid to. He would never dare take a chance. He was afraid to. What was he afraid of? Afraid you would get a hold of the letter. Afraid I would what? He was afraid you would get that letter. I would get the letter. Yes. And approximately what did he think would be the result of my getting possession of that letter? Well, he told me you would kill him if you found out he wrote home. I would kill him. Did you ever see me kill any people? No. And what else did he say besides telling you about committing this act upon him and not going to school and beating him? Did he tell you he did 90% of the work on the ranch? Yes. I see. Did he tell you I was away from the ranch a great deal? Yes. He did. Practically all the time? Most of the time, yes. Did he tell you anything about any alleged murders, Jesse? Yes. I wish you would tell me just what he said as nearly as you could in detail, as you remember. Well, I told him that if that is the way you were treating him, I would have to see that he went back to Canada. You would have to see that he went back to Canada? Yes, and he told me you would never let him get away. I wish you would speak a little louder. I cannot hear you very well. He told me you would never let him go back. My reason for so telling him, did he tell you? Yes. What was that? You said you would never dare let him out of your sight because you were afraid he would tell something. Tell what? Well, I asked him, and he told me that you had been doing something you would not ever want to get out. I see. And what was that something? I asked him, and he said, well, he killed a couple of little boys. Jessie asked Sanford about the murders. She recalled that he asked her, quote, if I had remembered reading in the papers about a little boy that was kidnapped. The boy in question was Walter Collins. She hadn't heard of the case since Saskatoon didn't receive American newspapers. She said to Sanford, was that the little boy? Sanford confirmed this for her. He also told her about how Northcott kept him at the ranch for a week and a half, and then he killed him once the search for the boy began. He also told her about the Winslow brothers and John Doe. More from Northcott's cross-examination of Jessie. Now, just what did he say the purpose of my bringing these various boys to the ranch was? There did not seem to be any purpose, except you just brought them out and treated them the same as you had treated him, and then you were afraid to take them back after having had them so long. I see. Did he ever tell you that I ever brought any person else there? No, he did not. About how long were you at the ranch before he told you this tale, before he told you that tale? Well, it was the next day when I was writing that letter. It was that night that he told me some, and the next day, and every time I got a chance to talk to him, I asked him something else. Did he say I had whipped him much out there to the ranch? Yes, sir. I see. Did he tell you why? There did not seem to be any reason. Lots of times you would just whip him. Just whip him for no reason at all. Because you liked to see him in pain. Because I liked to see him in pain. Yes, sir. He told you that. Yes, sir. If he did not do something to suit you, you would give him a licking for it. It took considerable fortitude for Sanford to confess these things to Jessie. Before she arrived, Stewart gave him explicit instructions on how to handle the visit. As he recounted, he told me to tell her that I did not want to go back to Canada, that I wanted to stay here, that I was going to school here and getting along all right. To convince Sanford of the validity of the threat he posed to him, Northcott, quote, beat me up and shoved me against the glass part of the window. It broke the window and cut a scar on my head. It also came to light that Louise witnessed this incident and did not object to Stewart's abusive conduct. In court, Jesse detailed the Dickensian conditions in which Sanford resided at Northcott's ranch. Stewart bossed Sanford around and bawled him out. Once I saw Stewart hit him on the arm with, what do you call it? He hit him with a wrench. I pretended I didn't see it. Stewart kept a revolver and a flashlight by his bedside. The day before, he showed me how he placed them exactly so that he could grab them in the dark. There were 2 bullet holes in the side of the wall. I cannot sleep on my right side. When I turned on my left side, I peered through the holes. They added to my horror. Stewart once told me that he dug a deep pit in the farm garage, 6 feet deep. This is where we keep our dead, he told me. He also told Jesse about his intentions for Stephen Black, the son of a garage station mechanic, whom he had twice tried to seduce. Sanford's getting to be a big rough man, he said, meaning that Sanford's voice was beginning to change. I am going to get Stevie for my new darling. On August 2nd, Sanford accompanied Jesse and Stewart to the house of George and Louise. This was planned, and while Stewart was occupied in the bathroom, Jesse gave Sanford his cue. Sanford ran away. Jesse arranged for him to stay with a friend of hers, a Los Angeles resident named Mrs. Svenning. Stewart was not worried at first. Eventually his concern mounted, and he took to the streets in his car, looking for him. Like John Doe, Sanford knew too much. He said he would inform the police, though there was no record of him having done so. Sanford was sent to stay with other family friends to ensure he would not be captured by Northcott. Jesse asked George why Stewart and Louise were returning to the ranch. George said it was to get rid of evidence, suggesting he knew what his son was up to. That night, Stewart and Louise worked at the ranch for hours. They returned to George's house dirty and disheveled. The next morning, Stewart returned to George's house while he was having breakfast. A confrontation broke out between Stewart and George. It woke Jessie. As she recalled, Stewart was calling Grandpa names, and then I heard this scuffle, as if he lunged at him or something. The first thing I really knew, I was awake. I heard Stewart running down the stairs. He ran. His car was at the back of the house. He ran and got this gun out of it, and then he came up to the back of the steps, and he was going to fix Grandpa for double-crossing him. He told Grandpa, he said if there had been a little more cooperation with him, this mess would not have happened at all. There had been a lot of things that would have been avoided. George just stood at the door there and tried to talk him down to calmness. That is all. Then George came in and shook me and told me to get up and that Stewart was raising the roof. And he reached in a little grip at the side of the bed and took out another gun. He took out a gun and he stayed guard at the door. I got up and started to put on my clothes. I went to the front door and was watching for my chance to get out. And when I did, the first chance I got, I went out. Jessie fled from the house. Stewart wasn't about to just let her get away. As she told it, Stewart came running up the steps. He grabbed hold of me and put his hands around me, around my neck, just for a minute. And I told him, I said, just leave me alone, let me go. I said, I am not going to say anything. So Grandma, she came running up and she told him to come back to the house. And she said something to me that sounded like, watch Grandpa, watch Dad, she said. She calls him Dad. I told him, if you let me alone, I will come myself. So he dropped his hands off me then. I came down the steps, but instead of going back and following him, I went up to the next house. A woman who lived in the house next door let her in. Her son-in-law drove her to Mrs. Svenning's house. Stewart tracked Sanford down and brought him back to the ranch. As Sanford recalled, he was pretty mad. He asked me why I did it. I told him I was afraid he was going to kill me. Northcott told Sanford he moved the bodies. He said that if Sanford ran away and turned Stewart into the police, there would be no evidence to back up his story. The subsequent week, Jesse and George devised a plan to go to the ranch and bring Sanford back with them, whereupon they would find temporary shelter for him in Los Angeles or send him back home to Canada. George promised to do his utmost to secure the boys asylum. They planned to go to the ranch to carry out this operation on a day when Stewart was to depart to San Diego for a few days. Stewart told Jesse that Sanford would be going to the mountains with his scout troop at that time. Jesse was fully aware that Sanford was not a member of the Boy Scouts. There was no way Stewart would have risked having Sanford socialize with outside youths while he concealed so many of Northcott's morbid secrets. One snag George and Jesse ran into when they descended upon the ranch was that Louise was there. She appeared both frightened and suspicious. She said to them, as Jesse recalled, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "What are you doing here, Louise?" And Grandpa didn't say anything. He just stood there. And she wanted to know what we had come out for. And we had just told her we had just come out for the day. So she says, "Well, you better come in the house and talk things over." And so we went in there. Grandpa didn't go in there. Louise acted as if she knew there was something up, and she acted as if she knew what it was. Sanford, who acted quite frightened about something, was in the house as well. Louise asked me what I had come out for and what I was trying to do. And then Stewart came in. It was just a few minutes after we got in the house that he came in. He said something like, "What's the idea? What are you trying to pull off?" Jesse stonewalled him. "Well, what are you trying to do? There must be something wrong. Sanford been telling you things?" "No." "What do you know? What are you trying to do?" "Well, I want to take Sanford home with me." "Well, do you think that is hardly fair to Sanford? He is getting along here fine. He is going to school, and he is learning something. Why should you want to take him home against his will?" "He is going to go home." "Well, what has Sanford been telling you?" "Nothing. All I know is he has not been going to school." "Are you sure of that?" "Yes, and I would not tell him anything." Stewart punched Jesse in the eye. Jesse was knocked off the chair and fell to the floor. Jesse said, "Afterwards, I went in, and when I lay down on the bed, he came in with ice packs, and Sanford would bring in ice packs, and Grandmother did also, and he told me then the idea of why Sanford could not go away. He said, 'There's an old friend of mine, a miner. One day I was over there visiting him, and his old partner that he used to be in business with came up to the mine to visit him, and they started a quarrel over some interest they had. And then the visiting miner, he pulled out a gun and was going to shoot him. And of course, to protect my friend, I shot him first. While I was outside, there was a little boy come running up. And this little boy said, 'Oh, you killed a man! You killed a man!' What can a man do? He had to get rid of the evidence. Of course, it's all been brought on us. It is not my fault. You can see that. But just the same, it would not look good if it was ever brought out." Of course, this was just another of Stewart Northcott's epic falsehoods. Jesse said, "He impressed upon me how important it was that Sanford should stay, that he knew all this, and that if he ever got away, he might tell it, and they made me promise that I would not tell. And they promised me that they would send Sanford to school, and I was to write to my mother and tell her how well he was getting along, so that she would not want him to come home. Jesse promised him she would do those things, and later that day, Stewart and Louise took Jesse back to George's house. Jesse said, "After I had found out this, I wanted to go back to Canada right away, but I was just delaying to try and get Sanford before I went, so that I could take him." Jesse and George tried again to return Sanford to Canada, but once again they were outsmarted by Stewart. He was angry at Sanford as before, threatening to kill him because he feared he would report him to the police. Back to the drawing board. Jessie returned to Canada. While in Vancouver, she went to the American consulate, where she submitted an affidavit about Stewart's conduct. She mentioned that he smuggled Sanford into America illegally. She noted his abuse of Sanford and the other victims. She said that Sanford was in grave danger and that Stewart committed several murders at his ranch. Meanwhile, Stewart sold many of his belongings, like furniture and farm equipment, in a mad dash to raise money. August 30th. Detective Lieutenant Chester A. Lloyd of the Los Angeles Police Department received a telegram from Canada. He detailed its content while being cross-examined by Northcott. We received a telegram from Canada requesting us to locate one Gordon Stewart Northcott, who had smuggled in one Sanford Clark illegally across the Canadian border. After investigation and running down many addresses, we located where he was supposed to live on Britannia Street. After talking to Mrs. Northcott, she informed us you were living out on a ranch near Norco with your nephew. We made a report to the immigration authorities at Los Angeles. According to a newspaper article, when Detective Lloyd and Detective Lieutenant E.L. Hamrin questioned Louise about the telegram's allegations, quote, she had flown into a rage, shouting, cursing, and waving her arms. They said she became calmer when they told her they wanted to question her son in connection with an automobile accident and gave the matter no further thought at the time, as young Clark's story of the Wineville murders had not then been told. August 31st, Stewart, Stephen Black, and Sanford gathered up more items for Stewart to sell. As they did, United States Immigration Service Inspector Judson F. Shaw and Inspector Scalorn were sent to the ranch to take Stewart and Sanford, quote, into custody and question them as to whether or not they had a legal right to be and remain in the United States or not. When Stewart saw the officers approaching, he prepared Sanford for an interrogation. As Sanford put it, he said that they were officers and he had better be going, and for me and Steve Black to say that he was in Los Angeles. Stewart ducked beneath the hen house and fled through the fields. When Shaw and Scalorn approached the house via the driveway, Sanford and Stephen walked up to meet them. The officers asked the boys for their names. Shaw, as Stewart put it, took Sanford out the driveway back of my machine and questioned him regarding the manner he came to the United States. He said he had been mistreated by Stewart Northcott. The officers looked for Northcott but could not find him. They took Sanford to Los Angeles. He was deposited at a juvenile hall. Stewart frantically sought legal representation. He was informed that he could avoid charges for immigration violations by returning to Canada. The fact that Sanford would soon be deported for being an illegal alien was another motivating factor, as he couldn't bear to be without Sanford. Louise also announced that she was returning to Canada. Stewart struggled to arrange for legal representation in Canada. Meanwhile, officers of the LAPD interviewed Sanford about Stewart Northcott's criminal activities at the chicken ranch. Chester A. Lloyd described what went down. We had received a letter from the American consul, I believe, informing us that some party by the name of Jesse Clark had made an affidavit or complaint to him that there had been some murders committed out on the Northcott chicken ranch near Norco, and her brother Sanford Clark was out there and his life was in danger, and requesting us to do all we could to investigate the case and see if there had been any crime committed, which we did. We asked Sanford what was in this letter we received from the American consul in Canada, informing him that Jesse Clark had made a statement as to the murders committed out on the Northcott ranch. And Sanford told us the whole story, the same as it was in the letter, and in the evidence that we had received. He was living out on the Northcott ranch with his uncle, Stewart Northcott, and he picked up a picture, maybe out of 30, that was on the table we had in the juvenile hall there, identifying one of them as Walter Collins. Lieutenant Stewart and myself, and Harrell and Bucks, got in a machine along with Sanford and went out to the ranch. Well, we went along over to the chicken house. There was a number of chicken houses there. We went in the first shed where he stated they were supposed to be buried. After doing some digging, the officers found that the, quote, shape of the hole we located there, the soil was loose, as though it had been dug before. Yes, sir, about 4 feet down. The soil was hard, kind of a hard pan, kind of a sandy loam, I should call it. We took the spade and got the outline of the hole, and then dug it out. After removing the straw from over the top, I should judge that first hole was around about 2.5 feet wide by 4.5 feet long, maybe 5. Why, we found loose earth, and down near the bottom of the grave, we found a quantity of lime. You may say the bottom of the grave was covered with lime. Officers found more lime outside. Sanford informed them that the bodies had been transferred to the chicken run. They dug into the soil adjacent to the incubator house and uncovered a larger hole, about 4.5 wide by 6 feet long. In the bottom of the grave, we found some, well, it looked to us like blood had run and mixed with the earth and caused it to be caked. The officers continued to dig and search around the ranch. In the incubator room, amid a number of sections of discarded clothing, Lloyd found a small cap. One of the officers asked Sanford if it belonged to him. He said it was too small for him to wear. They asked him if he remembered whose cap it was. He said, "It looks like the cap that Nelson Winslow had worn to the ranch." Detective Lloyd said, "So at that, we took the cap, and on our way back to Los Angeles that night, stopped in the Pomona police station, where we called Mr. Winslow and showed him the cap, and he identified it as belonging to his boy." Throughout the next few months, the ranch would become known as the Murder Farm. Several more pieces of evidence would emerge. The following is the text of a brief outlining the criteria for the indictment to be levied against Stewart Northcott. On the 14th day of September 1928, a 24-hour guard was placed on the Northcott ranch, and this guard remained there until after the trial of this case. It was on or about the 15th day of September 1928 that the graves above mentioned were opened by investigating officers. The odor of decayed human flesh was strong and repulsive. However, in the course of the intensive search of the ranch, all the dirt taken from the graves was screened twice and finally sluiced. From the bottom of the graves, and particularly from the end thereof, where the heads of the dead boys had rested, were taken great chunks of dirt saturated and highly impregnated with human blood. Numerous finger, hand, and foot bones were taken therefrom, as well as finger and toenails, human flesh, and human hair. From the Winslow grave was taken an incompletely formed human tooth, the tooth being one from a juvenile of 11 or 12 years of age. Likewise, a piece of cloth, the same as that of which the shirt worn by the younger Winslow boy was made. The lime spaded under by Sanford Clark was dug up, and it yielded quantities of human hair with follicles clinging, human skin and flesh crusted in lime, and quantities of human blood, as well as juvenile human bones. An examination of the lime piles just across the street from the ranch disclosed quantities of the above-mentioned items, as well as perfect exhibits of a part of a juvenile human skull. On the premises near the house were found pieces of burned human skull, a board on which had been sketched a yacht in blue and red crayons by the Winslow boys. The cap of the younger Winslow boy was found in one of the chicken units, and the toy violin keys from the toy banjo which Sanford Clark had burned were also found and identified. The axes used in killing the boys were recovered, the handles taken out, only to find that part of the handle enclosed by the eye of each axe was soaked with human blood. This blood remained within the eye of the axes, even though diligent effort was made to wash all blood from the axes immediately following the murders. George was arrested and detained as a material witness. He took the stand and was questioned about Stewart. The prosecutor asked him, "Has there ever been any evidence of insanity that you have observed in Stewart Northcott?" That is a pretty hard question to answer, because almost every father, mother, would not think it was insanity. Did you think it was not insanity? I know that he has been rather morbid disposition, looks at things different than what I always have. But everyone is differently constituted, can't all see things the same. You think he knows right from wrong? He has every reason to know it. This last statement wasn't exactly helpful to Stewart. Sanford took the stand. He went into detail about the murders of the victims, his treatment at the hands of Northcott, and the role Louise played in the crimes. The prosecutor started with, "Do you know what purpose Northcott had in bringing the boys there?" "Screw them." "You mean the crime against nature?" "Yes." "Did Louise know of the murder of the Winslow boys?" "Yes." "Was she there any time they were there?" "No." "How do you know she knew of it?" "Told her." "What did she say?" "She was considerably worried about it." "She was what?" "Worried about it." "Did Stewart offer any reason for killing these boys to her?" "So they would not tell on him." "Do you understand the meaning of the phrase, the infamous crime against nature, of sodomy?" "Yes." "Did your uncle, Stewart Northcott, ever do this to you?" "Yes." "More than once?" "Yes." "Do you remember about the last time that this happened to you by your uncle, Stewart Northcott?" "About a month ago." "Sometime during the month of August?" "Yes." "Do you remember what day of the month, that is, the date that you were taken into Los Angeles?" "About the 1st of the month, 1st of September." "About how many days before you were taken in was the last time that your uncle committed this offense upon you?" "About 2 days." "So it must have been as late as the 28th of the month then?" "Yes." "Why did you let him do this to you, use you in that way?" "Because he made me." "Make any threats?" "Yes." "Were you afraid of him?" "Yes." Gordon Stewart Northcott was charged with the murders of the 3 children and John Doe. He was also charged with sodomy for the sexual abuse of Sanford. Louise was indicted along with Stewart for the murder of Walter Collins. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested Louise and Stewart on September 19th. Stewart was remanded to Alcala Prison in Vancouver. Speaking of which, Stewart had plenty to say about the legal entanglements in which he found himself. "The charges against me are melodramatic to the extreme. They are born from the brain of a boy who has read too many lurid detective and mystery stories, and from the mind of a girl who likes sensationalism and notoriety. Sanford was a stupid boy, and one extremely hard to handle. I never abused him, though. I did punish him at times, but then in a mild way. The lad was a source of continuous trouble, and one time disappeared, and I had to make an extensive search for him. About this time, I had trouble with neighbors. As a result of this trouble, some of them were jailed. This did not make me at all popular in the district. The police records will show of this trouble. As for his thoughts on Jessie, he said, "She is of the type that likes sensationalism and publicity. During her stay with us, she was in constant consultation with Sanford, and the two seemed to be plotting something. The situation became so strained that she was ordered from the farm and went to Los Angeles, where she joined Father, who left the ranch some time before. She joined with him, and there was considerable trouble. Father had to leave the place on my demand because he had struck Mother. He has not spoken to me since that trouble, which was 6 or 8 months ago. As for the exhumation of bones on his ranch," he said, "diseased hens were put among my own fowls, and as a result, I lost many of them. Those digging for bodies on the farm will find many bones of these fowls. Let them dig. They will find no human remains. Knowing that land, I can say they will have worn their hands to the bone, digging, and they will not find any evidence. There is no evidence to find." He issued this statement to the Californian media. "I am sure the taxpayers of Riverside County, I being one myself, do not relish the idea of wasting money on farce trials. We need roads and bridges in Riverside County, not ridiculous yet expensive criminal trials. The whole case is simply that of a dissatisfied husband seeking divorce grounds, a movie publicity mad girl, from whose mind all these ideas came, and a lazy, stupid boy half-cracked from reading too many detective thrillers and seeing too many Wild West movies, all seeking notoriety. It is, to say the least, melodramatic in the extreme. A mysterious mine fights over hidden gold. An ape man. Good reading, yes, but hardly possible in real life. It is ridiculous to even imagine that a woman of 60 would change from a loving, hard-working little mother to a murdering assassin. As for myself, if I, either mentally or physically, am an ape man, then according to the officers of the provincial police, they also must be living proof of the Darwin theory. They state that they consider me a perfectly normal boy." The language of mendacity was practically Gordon Stewart Northcott's lingua franca, so he was well equipped to spread lies in a fashion that might have made him appear sincere to the impressionable. He went on, "Why blame all the disappearances and murders in California on me? It is a wonder that, considering all the terrible crimes I am charged with, that they do not try to set Hickman free and blame me for the Marion Parker murder or lay the St. Francis Dam tragedy on Mother." On November 6th, a Canadian judge, after having been briefed on the offenses for which Northcott was charged in California, ordered his extradition to the United States to face justice. Northcott declared during his trip to California that he considered the extradition to be illegal and that he planned to appeal. He never did. He fired his attorney. He complained about the treatment he received from the media. "It's rotten. The reporters should be arrested." November 30th, Northcott arrived in Los Angeles and was remanded to the county jail. There he received 2 bouquets of flowers from anonymous admirers. His communiques leading up to the day of his sentencing included lies, distortions, wild goose chases in evidence-gathering efforts, and blame-shifting. He was self-righteous, self-aggrandizing, and completely full of shit. February 8th, 1929. Gordon Stewart Northcott was convicted for the murders of John Doe, the Winslow boys, and the kidnapping and molesting of the latter. February 13th, Northcott was sentenced to death. October 2nd, 1930. Northcott was hung at San Quentin State Prison. The rope failed to break his neck at first, prolonging the asphyxiation process by 13 minutes until he finally died. South Africa is a country of major contradictions. It is one of the most beautiful countries in the world, with stunning landscapes that vary from majestic mountain ranges to picture-perfect beaches to bushlands that are ideal for hunting. It is, however, a country that has had a sordid past. At the turn of the 19th century, thousands of Afrikaner women and children lost their lives in the concentration camps set up by the British and segregation or apartheid, which ensured that from 1948 to the early 90s, anyone who was not white would not thrive. This oppression was finally discarded when Nelson Mandela was set free in 1990. He would eventually become the president in 1994, and while he was the head of the country, there was a sense of hope, reconciliation, and peace, but that did not last. Despite the fact that South Africa not only won the Rugby World Cup and the Cricket World Cup this year, it remains one of the most dangerous countries in the world, ranking in the top 20 of places where crime is rampant. Corruption is rife, maintenance is not done on roads, buildings, or any of the government entities, and rolling blackouts that sometimes last for hours and sometimes for days make daily life difficult. The rate of unemployment is escalating rapidly, and unless you are incredibly wealthy, chances are you will be a victim of crime. The cost of violence is that there has been a brain drain with people who can afford it. Immigrating tourists and investors becoming more hesitant to give the economy a boost. There are not enough members of the police force to exercise the laws of the land, and bribery and corruption are so prevalent that no one trusts the police. It is therefore no surprise to learn that South Africa is the country that ranks third in having the most serial killers in the world. I'm going to tell you about a serial killer that, if it was not for his confession and the sharp instincts of a detective, would have probably never been caught. This is the case of Steward Wilken and the unbelievable crimes he almost got away with. To those who knew him in Port Elizabeth, Steward Wilken was the creepy man who lived in the bush, who always wore the same pair of dirty jeans, shirt, and Wellington boots. Locals said he was not a tall man, at about 5'6", with a mop of unkempt dark hair and a prevalent, even more disheveled beard and a pot belly. He was crude, rude, bombastic, and quick to anger. Folks started to call this Afrikaans man Boetie Boer, which roughly translates to little brother farmer. The word Boer is also a word Afrikaners used to call themselves during the apartheid era. But before we talk about his crimes, let me talk about a childhood I would not wish on my worst enemy. To say that Steward Wilken had a rocky start is an understatement. He was born on the 11th of November, 1966, but at the age of only 6 months old, he and his 2-year-old sister were abandoned by his mother in a phone booth in Boksburg. It would be here that Stewart and his sister were found by a domestic worker who decided that the best option was not to go to a place that rendered social services, but to take the children to her employer's home. This was a fate far worse than any child deserves. It's important to note that Stewart lies a lot, but the following has been proven as fact by others. Neglect and depravity do not begin to describe his life during the first 2 years. All we know about the home he ended up in was that the man of the house was called Dope, D-O-P-E. Steward was abused and forced to eat with the dogs on the ground and was chained up outside like dogs. Dope was a fond participant in the act of bestiality, and after he was done, Stewart was forced to lick his private parts clean. Dope would burn Stewart's genitals with a cigarette, and he was always dirty. During his stay in this dysfunctional home, his sister just vanished one day. The Wilken family, who were neighbors, took pity on the child and offered to adopt Steward. They were the people who would give Stewart his first and last name. No one has any idea what his original birth name was. The Wilkens reported that Stewart was in a terrible state when they took custody of him, was covered in lice, suffered from malnutrition, was in obvious need of care. The couple felt tremendous pity for the child and wanted to adopt him. In order for this to happen, they contacted social services, who found his mother. All Stewart remembers about this interaction was that an unfamiliar woman came to the house one day and offered him candy. He rejected the offer, but the Wilken family was successful in their adoption of the little boy. Mrs. Wilken would report that Stewart was a very difficult child from the first day. His behavior was inappropriate, he would lash out, and he would bite people. He failed grade 1, and because she perhaps did not grasp the deep trauma the child had suffered, decided to keep his Christmas presents from him as punishment. Stewart was angry at this decision and vowed never to try to excel on the academic front. He made it to grade 3, but he managed to fail this grade 3 times. The decision was made to put him in a class for children with special needs and learning disabilities. He claims he was bullied in the class by the teacher and that she encouraged the other children to tease him about being adopted. He said that up and until that point, he had no idea he was adopted. His temper could be turned on at the slightest provocation, and one day he attacked his teacher. As his punishment, the headmaster gave him a caning in front of all the children. According to him, the headmaster encouraged another boy to assault him. When he retaliated, he was punished again. He was sent home, where he received even more punishment. Stewart said that he started smoking weed at the age of 8. Apparently, he wet the bed every night and was punished for it. At the age of 9, he claims that he was sodomized by a deacon of the church. He never seemed to share the abuse with his adoptive parents, but tragedy would strike the household, and Mrs. Wilken would be forced to call in professional help for her wayward son. Mr. Wilken became very ill and would eventually pass away, leaving his ill-equipped wife to deal with Steward. She found herself at her wit's end, and Steward was sent to an industrial reform school to finish his schooling. Steward was raped by the older boys in school, which caused him to run away to his adoptive aunt to stay with her. After a month, she told him he had to go back to his mother, who by that time had moved to Port Elizabeth. She gave him food and bus fare and sent him on his way. He was technically on the run from the mandated stay at the school and was forced to appear in front of a magistrate who determined that as long as he finished grade 11, he did not need to go back to the reform school. Stewart agreed and actually managed to pass the grade, but he also decided that this was the end of his school career. The following year, he joined the army. This was a time in South Africa when all eligible men who were 18 years of age or older had to complete a compulsory military service. Within 3 months, Stewart had tried to commit suicide, and he was discharged from the military. At the age of 18, he met a woman called Lynn at a nightclub. The two moved in together with her daughter from a previous marriage. Lynn would give birth to their daughter, Wayne. On Christmas Day in 1994, Lynn claimed that after the birth, Steward lost all interest in vaginal sex and only wanted anal sex. Steward told a different story, claiming that Lynn was a sex worker and had loose morals. He would force her to take off her underwear when she came back from anywhere to smell if she had been with another man. He would also claim that she left him at night with the children to do this type of work. This, by all accounts, is completely untrue. There was so much instability in the home that the Department of Social Services threatened to take Lynn's older daughter away if the couple did not sort themselves out. For some strange reason, the department felt that if the couple was married, it would solve all their problems, and this couple, that should not have been in a relationship in the first place, got married when Wayne was 5 years old. The marriage remained violent and abusive, and Lynn would have frequently called the police because of Steward's use of weed. He would eventually be admitted to a psychiatric hospital where he was diagnosed as a psychopath. His stay was brief, and he left without any future plans to address the trauma he had suffered as a child or to learn coping skills to live with his personality disorder. According to Steward, he had a good relationship with the little girl, but the conflict between him and Lynn's new husband often became violent to the point where Steward was only allowed to visit his daughter on the pavement in front of the house. Steward had been working as a joiner until he hurt his hand in an accident at work and was forced to go on disability pension. Despite his disability, he found it easy to find work on fishing trawlers, but his difficult personality and outbursts of anger often caused him to be kicked off the boats. Steward would visit his daughter every now and again. Lynn called the police, and when he saw the cops, he tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose of tablets. The divorce would, however, go through, and Lynn remarried soon after the divorce. This would come into play in his future crimes. What the world did not know about Steward Wilken was that by the time he got divorced, he had already killed, starting at the age of 23 years old, 5 people. His first confirmed kill was in February of 1990 and happened around the time he got married to Lynn. It's speculated that the pressure that the Department of Social Services had placed on him had somehow triggered his attack. His first victim was a 15-year-old black street child named Montefico. It is a sad reality that the streets of the cities of South Africa are saturated with street children who have fled either abusive homes or tried to make a better life for themselves, only to be sucked into the depravity they held. Hundreds of thousands of children live under cardboard boxes and sleep in stairwells, and daily this figure grows and grows. Steward anally raped the child and then strangled him to death on the grounds of a local primary school. He said he ejaculated the moment he saw the child's spirit leave his body. On the 3rd of October of the same year, he changed his victim profile and set his sights on a sex worker. He met Virginia Gassman, and the two agreed on the price of 50 rand for sex. That amounts to about $4. Before you think I am a racist, a quote-unquote colored is the word everyone, including those it refers to, call people of mixed race in South Africa. Steward would also claim later that he only had sex with colored women out of fear that he might have sex by accident with his estranged sister. After he had vaginal sex with a 25-year-old woman in a schoolyard, he insisted on having anal sex. She refused. This enraged Steward, and he would strangle her with her own clothing. He said that he liked to face his victims when he killed them because he liked what he called the jelly bean effect. This refers to the bulging of the eyes and the swelling of the lips as his victims are strangled to death. In January 1991, a sex worker by the name of Marcia Perpenthus would meet her fate at the hands of Steward Wilken. The two met at a local hotel and went to St. George's Park to complete the transaction. Marcia asked for the money up front, which enraged Steward, and he strangled her to death. Despite the fact that they had agreed on the transaction, Stewart said that he believed that sex is a natural act and should be enjoyed for free. This will be the first time Stewart dipped his toes into necrophilia, and he had sex with a dead body. From this point on, Stewart would hide his victims better, and he would insert newspapers in them. This would prevent insects from entering the cavities and allow him to return a number of times to fulfill his latest desire. Sadly, the next victim was a 14-year-old street child who, to this day, remains without a name. Stewart claims that he had strangled the child after the boy had asked for money after they had anal sex. This 14-year-old boy was sodomized and strangled, and Stewart frequently returned to this victim. The remains of the child would only be found 2 years later. He then took another 14-year-old boy to a closed museum at night, where he raped and strangled the child to death. He said he killed the child because he threatened to tell the police about the rape. There seems to be a gap after this last killing. Stewart had met a woman named Veronica. Veronica had 2 little boys from a previous relationship. He married Veronica, but he did nothing to stop his violent behavior, and this marriage was also short-lived. Veronica's family could not stand the sight of him from the onset. At one point, he and Veronica moved in with Lynn, of all people, for a short while. On the 27th of July 1995, Stewart picked up Georgina Tashin, and the two made an agreement to have sex for 30 rand in a park. Once again, the agreement went out the window, and 42-year-old Georgina was sodomized and strangled. This is when Stewart shifted gears into a higher form of depravity. He first took a knife and repeatedly inserted it into her vagina. After mutilating her genitals, he cut off her nipples and ate them. He would later say that his only regret was that he wished he had cooked it first. He also cut off a piece of her vagina and ate that. He said the reason he cut her was that he was still aroused but could not get an erection. During this time, he had only been staying with Veronica on a part-time basis and preferred to live in the bush. It's also about this time that people started to refer to him as Boti Bor, but this is not an endearing name. Afrikaners during apartheid used to call themselves Borer. Stewart embraced the name. Stewart had been watching the crime scenes as police discovered the bodies. As he watched the forensic teams move the bodies, he took notes on how to better hide the bodies in the future. He also knew he had left evidence on the victims' clothing, and from this point on, he would strip them from their clothing before hiding them. Stewart might not have had a high intellect, but he was streetwise and learned as he committed his crimes. At this time, the relationship between Stewart and Veronica deteriorated. He had fled to the bush to live in an area called Happy Valley, after a case of sodomy was made against him for the rape of her 2 children. Happy Valley used to be a great area to picnic, with an amusement park and figurines of fairy tale characters. Now, in 2023, it is more likely that you will get robbed and raped in this scenic landscape. Stewart had made himself a nest of sorts in the bush with a view of the sea he so deeply loved. On the 29th of September 1995, Stewart visited Wayne. Her half-sister would say that she last saw her little sister on the pavement in front of the house talking to her father. The 10-year-old little girl would never be seen alive again. Steward would say later that he decided to take Wayne to Happy Valley to show her the pixies and the fairies and to experience the magic the place held. Afterwards, he took her to his shelter, and it is here where his daughter allegedly told him that her stepfather had been molesting her. Steward made her undress completely and performed an examination, and according to him, he determined that this was true. He then strangled her to death because he said he did not want her to suffer the same way he did. In his eyes, he was sending her to heaven and saving her from a life of pain. He kept the body and slept next to it for months until it was skeletonized. When there was almost nothing left of her, he would arrange her clothing and sleep next to that. He denies that he ever raped his daughter, but the skeleton was in such a state of decay that it was impossible to tell. Renowned South African profiler Mickey Pretorius would say later after an interview that he more than likely did, but was too embarrassed to admit it. During an interview with her, Steward got so aroused that he had to excuse himself to go and masturbate in his cell. Steward was interviewed regarding the disappearance of his daughter, but he claimed that he had left her on the pavement that fateful day. Steward was dormant for about 8 months, but on the 25th of May, 1996, he met a sex worker named Katrina Clayson. Once again, he went back on their agreement, raped her on the beach, and strangled her to death with her own clothing. He had also shoved a plastic bag down her throat to prevent her from screaming. He dumped her body next to a wall with graffiti that read, "People should not steal," which he found amusing because he believed sex should be free and paying for it made him a victim of theft. Between May and August, Steward would take the life of another street child whose identity was also never discovered. He sodomized, strangled, and dumped the child in the same schoolyard he had left his first victim. Veronica would take her claims of the rape of her 2 boys to the police. Up until this point, Steward had been living with Veronica on a part-time basis, but after the charges were made, he fled to live in the bush. His final victim was 12-year-old Henry Bakers, who lost his life on the 22nd of January, 1997. Steward knew the boy and had even stayed at their home for a short time. Henry was on his way from his mother's home to his grandmother's home when he crossed roads with Steward. It would be another little boy that would identify Steward as the last person to be seen with the serial killer. The boy had run after the 2 and asked them where they were going to which Steward responded that he should mind his own business. This witness would be the small crack that would eventually shatter the entire case open. According to Steward, Henry had asked him to teach him about sex, and that the boy went willingly with him. He had taken the boy to his dwelling in the bush, where he undressed the boy and masturbated him. He then forced the child to perform oral sex on him, and then sodomized him. When the boy started to scream, Steward strangled him to death. Initially, his mother thought he had been staying with his grandmother, but when he had not returned after 2 days, and she had confirmed by telephone that he had not arrived at his grandmother's, she realized that her child had been missing for days, and she went to the police. The Child Protection Unit was contacted, and a search began in earnest. The same officers were involved with the other cases involving Wayne and the rape of Veronica's children. When the young witness mentioned that the last person to be seen with Henry was Steward, they knew they had to have a closer look at him. On the 28th of January 1997, Steward was arrested in connection with the disappearance of Henry Bakers, but he appeared to be horrified that the child was missing. He claimed that he had nothing to do with the disappearance, and even gave the police an alibi, and that evening he was released. Steward's alibi did not check out, however, and on the 30th of January he was rearrested. They made the wise decision to contact the detectives from the murder and robbery squad, and soon all Steward's crimes would be revealed. Sergeant Derek Norsworthy was not your ordinary cop. Years of experience had sharpened his ability to read people, and from the moment the docket of the missing little boy, Henry Baker's, crossed his table, he knew this was no ordinary disappearance. For one thing, the same name popped up in 2 other cases the police had been investigating. He knew there was more to this man sitting in front of him, especially after learning about his violent past. Norsworthy asked around and eventually got the dirty 31-year-old Steward tracked down in his little nest in the bush. From the moment the arrogant and self-assured man stepped into his office, Norsworthy knew he had the man responsible for the crimes he was tasked to solve. But Steward would not budge. He claimed to know nothing about the crimes and said about his daughter that he had left her on the sidewalk the day she vanished. Norsworthy was not buying the bag of bullshit Stewart was trying to sell him, and during the interview, he decided to step out of his office for a little while. Surrounded by Norsworthy's ample diplomas and certificates on the wall, all related to catching serial killers and perpetrators of major crimes, and with a picture of Norsworthy's own daughter staring at him from a picture frame on the table, Stewart had a change of heart. Norsworthy looked Stewart straight in the eye and asked him if he was responsible for the disappearance of Henry. When the man who would catch the man who had flown under the police's radar for 7 years returned to his office, Stewart looked at him with his palms turned up in surrender and said, "I am sick." And with those words, the crimes of Botik Bor not only came to an end, but were laid bare for the whole world to see. Stewart even sobbed on the phone. Stewart admitted to killing 10 people, although he thought it might be 12 or even as many as 17. He told Norsworthy that he had just returned from defiling Henry's body the very morning he had been arrested. Stewart agreed to show the police where the bodies of the 2 children were. Mickey Pretorius would say later that she found Stewart a contradiction. He was highly sexually charged, and despite him portraying himself as a friendly and calm person, he was unable to control his impulses. She believed that he just saw what he wanted and he took it. His confessions and interviews were crude and rude, to say the least, and during each, he made no attempt to show remorse. Norsworthy would also manage to track down Stewart's biological mother and facilitated a conversation over telephone between the two. While speaking to his mother, Stewart's manner and tone of voice converted to that of a little child, and for the first time in his life, he called someone Mommy. He also discovered that the reason he and his sister were left in the telephone booth was because she was pregnant and in an abusive relationship. He also learned that his sister had not simply vanished. His mother came to fetch her and chose to leave him behind. In 2005, Stewart's ex-wife, Lynn, was murdered. She had been walking to a phone with a daughter to call her husband when 3 men stopped next to them, grabbed her, forced her into the car, and sped off, leaving the young girl stunned at what had just happened. Her body was found the following day. She had been beaten with a blunt object, mutilated, and was unrecognizable. Dr. Gerhard Labuschnaga, another renowned profiler in South Africa, interviewed Stewart after Dr. Labuschnaga left the police force, like so many good, committed, and qualified policemen do. In the interview, Stewart said about the crimes, "I would strangle them while having sex. I would go into another world where I am strangling and raping them. When I was strangling them, they would go limp, like a jellyfish. made me feel like a king. I had sex with some of the dead bodies. Then I can have my extract. Then I can do things I wanted to. There is no screaming. I would masturbate at the body also. When asked about his motive, Steward would say, I wanted to be God. He believed that God did not help him, so he would become God. He said it was pure revenge. Steward Wilken was charged with 10 counts of murder and 5 counts of sodomy on the 3rd of February 1997. The only time he had shown any emotion during the trial was on the day he heard his sentence, when he burst into tears. On the 20th of February 1998, Stewart was convicted of 7 charges of murder and 2 charges of sodomy. Justice Chris Jansen sentenced him to 7 life sentences and stated that if it were not for the fact that the death penalty was abolished in 1995, he would have definitely seen this option as the appropriate penalty for the crimes. Stewart spent the first couple of years in Bloemfontein in a private prison due to his mental health, but he requested to be transferred to St. Albans Prison in Port Elizabeth. He claims that he suffers from terrible nightmares and that the ghosts of his victims haunt him. He also says that once he is released, he wants to look for his sister. But you may ask, how could that be possible with 7 life sentences? With the overcrowding and lack of resources in South Africa, many criminals who were not supposed to see the world outside the prison walls had been released, and it is unfortunately not beyond belief that he actually might get parole. The case of Steward Wilken, aka Botti Bor, is one of a serial killer who definitely did not follow the serial killer rule book. For one thing, instead of investigators having to hunt down a serial killer, the serial killer confessed and they had to go look for the bodies. His victimology is also fascinating in that he chose adult women, male children, and even killed his own daughter, which very seldom happens in a serial killer profile. To commit necrophilia, he only returned to the bodies of his male victims. In Port Elizabeth, the name of Steward Wilken is mostly unknown and has been forgotten, but I believe that is why we tell these stories, to keep us on our toes and to learn about this very special breed of human monster. The Gordon Stewart Northcott story was written by Morgan Rector, and the Steward Wilken story was written by Misdemeanor. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.